I used to believe betrayal announced itself loudly, with slammed doors and screaming matches, with undeniable proof that left no room for doubt. But the truth is, betrayal is quiet at first. It slips into your life wearing familiar faces, speaking in voices you trust, smiling across dinner tables like nothing has changed. That's how it was with Lydia. She had been my best friend since college, the kind of friend who knew where I kept the spare key and how I took my coffee, who held my hair back when I was sick and danced barefoot with me in my living room when life felt too heavy. When Daniel proposed to me after 4 years together, Lydia cried harder than anyone. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that she couldn't wait to stand beside me on my wedding day. I believed her. I had no reason not to. Daniel and I met through a nonprofit we both volunteered for. Community work was the foundation of our relationship, the thing that made us feel like we were building something meaningful together. That's why the annual charity gala mattered so much to us. It wasn't just a fancy night with donors and speeches. It was a symbol of who we were and what we valued. Lydia had slowly become involved too, attending planning meetings, offering ideas, always eager to help. I thought it was sweet. I thought it meant she supported us. The first crack appeared so small I almost missed it. Daniel started coming home later, saying meetings ran long. Lydia began texting him directly instead of going through me, usually about gala details. When I mentioned it, they both laughed it off. I told myself I was being insecure. I trusted them. Trust, I learned later, can become a blindfold if you cling to it too tightly. The night I found out wasn't dramatic. No lipstick on a collar, no phone buzzing with incriminating messages. It was an email, a simple calendar notification that popped up on our shared tablet while Daniel was in the shower. Dinner with Lydia. No mention of me. No explanation. Just the date and time. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the floor disappeared beneath me. I told myself there had to be an innocent reason, that maybe it was a surprise for me. That hope lasted exactly 12 minutes until I opened his email and saw the thread beneath it. The words blurred as I read them, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit down. They weren't just flirting, they were planning a future that didn't include me. When Daniel came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, humming like everything was normal, I realized something inside me had already broken. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just asked him, very calmly, how long it had been going on. His face told me before his mouth ever did. He tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't supposed to happen, that feelings just grew. Lydia, my Lydia, had been confiding in him about her loneliness, about how she felt like she lived in my shadow. Somehow, that confession had turned into stolen moments and whispered promises. I asked him to leave that night. He packed a bag in silence, unable to look at me. I didn't cry until the door closed behind him. That was when the grief hit, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't just losing my fiancé. I was losing the life I thought I was building, the future I had imagined so clearly it felt real enough to touch. And I was losing my best friend, the person I would have turned to for comfort if it had been anyone else. Lydia didn't reach out at first. When she finally did, it was a long message filled with justifications disguised as apologies. She said she never meant to hurt me, that love was complicated, that she hoped someday I would understand. I didn't reply. I didn't have the strength. I focused on surviving each day, on showing up to work, on breathing through the ache in my chest that refused to fade. The gala was 3 months away. Part of me wanted to step down, to disappear from anything that reminded of them. But another part of me, quieter but stubborn, refused to let my pain erase everything I had worked for. I stayed on as co-chair. I told myself it was about the cause, not about them. In truth, it was also about reclaiming something that felt stolen. I didn't know Lydia and Daniel would attend together until I saw their names on the guest list. By then, it was too late to change anything without causing a scene. I prepared myself the best I could, practicing polite smiles in the mirror, reminding myself that I didn't owe anyone my breakdown. What I wasn't prepared for was the way Lydia would look at me that night, standing beside Daniel as if she belonged there, as if she hadn't torn my life apart. The gala itself shimmered with elegance. Soft music filled the ballroom, lights reflecting off crystal glasses and polished floors. I moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting donors, thanking volunteers, playing my role. Every step felt heavy, but I kept going. When I finally saw Lydia across the room, her eyes locked on mine and her lips curved into a smile that wasn't friendly or apologetic. It was triumphant. She approached me during cocktail hour, Daniel hovering just behind her. She looked stunning, I'll give her that. Confident, untouchable. "She didn't expect to see you so composed," she said lightly, her eyes flicking over my dress. "I guess heartbreak suits you." The words stung more than I expected. I felt the room tilt, the noise fading into a dull hum, but I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I met her gaze and said, "I'm glad you could support the cause." My voice surprised me with its steadiness. She laughed, a soft, cruel sound. "Oh, we are," she said, looping her arm through Daniel, "in more ways than one." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just unrepentant, she was proud. She wanted me to hurt. And for a brief second, I did. Then something else took over, a calm clarity I hadn't felt in months. I excused myself, walking away before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking, but my steps were sure. Because Lydia didn't know everything. She didn't know what happened after Daniel left. She didn't know who had helped me pick up the pieces when I couldn't do it alone. As I moved toward the stage to prepare for my speech, I spotted him near the back of the room. He wasn't dressed like the other guests, no tuxedo or polished smile, just a quiet presence that grounded me instantly. Our eyes met, and he gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Lydia was still laughing behind me, basking in her perceived victory, completely unaware that the story she thought she was starring in was about to change in ways she never imagined. When I saw him standing there, near the edge of the ballroom where the lights softened and the noise dulled, something inside my chest finally loosened. Marcus had never liked crowds, never liked attention. He was the kind of man who chose corners and listened more than he spoke, who noticed details other people rushed past. We met 6 weeks after Daniel left, on a day when I had forced myself to attend a donor luncheon because canceling felt like giving up. I remember sitting at a round table, nodding politely while barely hearing the conversation, when a glass of water appeared in front of me. I looked up, startled, and there he was, apologizing for interrupting, saying he noticed I hadn't touched my drink and thought I might need it. It was such a small gesture, almost nothing, but it broke through the fog I'd been living in. Someone saw me. Marcus was a quiet consultant hired by one of our larger sponsors to help evaluate long-term impact strategies. We didn't flirt, we didn't exchange lingering looks. We talked about the work, about community programs, about how burnout sneaks up on people who care too much. Over time, those conversations became something I looked forward to. He never asked about Daniel, he never pushed, he simply showed up steady and kind week after week, until one day I realized I was laughing again, really laughing. That realization scared me more than the betrayal ever did. At the gala, seeing Marcus there felt surreal. He wasn't supposed to attend, consultants rarely did, but one of the board members had insisted, wanting him to see the results of the strategies he'd helped design. Marcus had hesitated, worried it might be overwhelming for me. I told him I'd be fine. Standing there now, knowing he'd come anyway, knowing he cared enough to be present, steadied me in a way I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage when my name was announced. The room quieted, hundreds of eyes turning toward me. I felt Lydia's gaze like a weight on my back, felt Daniel's too, uncertain and restless. I began my speech the way I always did, thanking donors, acknowledging volunteers, speaking about the mission that brought us all together. My voice carried, clear and calm, even as my heart raced. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I spoke about resilience, about how this year had taught me that even when personal foundations crumble, the work doesn't stop, that community can hold you when you can't hold yourself. I didn't name names, I didn't air my pain, but every word was true. As I finished, the applause rose slowly, then filled the room. I stepped down from the stage, my legs trembling. Marcus met me halfway, handing me a glass of water, his eyes warm with quiet pride. "You were incredible," he said softly. The way he said it, without exaggeration, without trying to fix anything, made my throat tighten. That was when Lydia froze. She had been watching from across the room, her smile fixed and smug, until she noticed where my attention had gone. I saw the exact moment recognition dawned, when her eyes narrowed and followed my gaze. Marcus turned slightly, sensing the shift, and Lydia's expression shattered. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost alarming. She knew him. Not well, but enough. Marcus was her cousin's ex-husband, the one she'd mocked relentlessly years ago for being too serious and not ambitious enough, the one she said would never amount to anything because he chose non-profit consulting over corporate wealth. The irony hung heavy between us. She crossed the room with sharp, determined steps, Daniel trailing behind her, confused. "Marcus," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land, "what are you doing here?" Marcus turned fully now, polite but distant. "Good evening," he replied. He didn't use her name. That omission spoke volumes. Lydia's eyes flicked to me, then back to him. "I didn't realize you were involved with this organization, or involved at all." "I consult," he said simply, "and I'm here to support someone important to me." The silence that followed felt electric. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, finally understanding there was something he'd missed. Lydia's jaw clenched. "That's interesting," she said, her tone brittle. "I didn't know you and her were close." Marcus glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded. He took my hand then, openly, without hesitation. The warmth of it spread through me, grounding me in the present. "We are," he said. "Very." Lydia's laugh came out sharp and hollow. "Wow," she said, "that was fast. I guess you don't waste any time moving on." I felt a familiar urge to defend myself, to explain timelines and circumstances. Instead, I did something new. I said nothing. Marcus didn't either. He simply met her gaze, calm and unwavering. Lydia faltered under it. For the first time that night, she didn't have control of the narrative. Daniel cleared his throat. "Lydia, maybe we should—" "Not now," she snapped, then caught herself, plastering on a smile for the people nearby. She leaned closer to me, lowering her voice. "I hope you're happy, truly, but don't pretend this is some kind of victory." I met her eyes, seeing not a triumphant rival, but a deeply insecure woman who measured her worth by comparison. "I'm not pretending, and this isn't about you." That was the moment her composure finally cracked. She straightened abruptly, muttered something about needing air, and walked away, leaving Daniel behind. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in months. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. It wasn't enough. It never would be. I nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them, and turned back to Marcus. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and congratulations. Lydia avoided me, her earlier confidence replaced by tight smiles and hurried exits. When the gala ended and the last guests filtered out into the night, I felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settle over me. Marcus walked me outside, the cool air a relief after the heat of the ballroom. We stood there for a moment, city lights flickering around us. "I didn't plan any of that. I hope it didn't put you in an awkward position." He smiled gently. "I came because I wanted to be here. Everything else is just noise." That night didn't magically erase my pain. Healing doesn't work like that. But it marked a turning point. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt something close to peace. Not because Lydia was embarrassed or because Daniel looked regretful, but because I saw clearly that their choices no longer defined me. I had survived their cruelty. I had found connection in unexpected places, and I had learned that dignity, once reclaimed, is far more powerful than any public humiliation. In the days after the gala, I kept replaying that moment in my mind. The way Lydia's smile collapsed when she realized she no longer had the upper hand. I didn't feel joy about it, not the sharp, vindictive kind people expect in stories like this. What I felt instead was a strange, quiet relief, like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for months. The gala had been a mirror, reflecting back truths that none of us could ignore anymore. And while Lydia retreated into silence afterward, my own life began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus and I didn't rush into anything. If anything, we slowed down. We talked more than we touched. Long walks after work, sitting on park benches while the city hummed around us, sharing stories that had nothing to do with Lydia or Daniel. He told me about his marriage, how it ended not with a dramatic blow-up, but with years of feeling unseen, of being told his values were impractical, his empathy a weakness. I told him about my tendency to give too much, to equate loyalty with self-erasure. There was no judgment between us, only recognition. Two people who had been bent by disappointment, learning how to stand straight again. Lydia, on the other hand, couldn't let go. A week after the gala, she sent me a message that was half apology, half accusation. She wrote that I had embarrassed her, that bringing Marcus into the picture felt calculated, as if I'd planned some elaborate revenge. Reading her words, I realized how differently we experienced the same events. Where I had simply lived my life, she saw competition. Where I had found support, she saw a threat. I didn't respond. Silence, I was learning, can be a boundary, not a punishment. Daniel tried again, too. He asked to meet for coffee, saying he needed closure. I almost agreed out of habit, out of the old reflex to prioritize his comfort. But when I pictured sitting across from him, listening to explanations I no longer needed, I felt tired. I replied politely, wishing him well and declining. Hitting send felt like setting down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for too long. Work became a refuge. The organization saw a surge in donations after the gala, and with it came new projects, new responsibilities. I threw myself into it, not as an escape, but as a reminder of who I was outside of my relationships. Marcus supported me without hovering, checking in when he knew deadlines were heavy, celebrating small wins with quiet dinners and shared smiles. He never tried to fix me. He never needed to. That in itself was healing. One afternoon, a month after the gala, I ran into Lydia unexpectedly at a grocery store. She looked different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself, smaller somehow. She hesitated when she saw me, then approached with a tentative smile. "Can we talk?" she asked. We stood near the produce section, the ordinary setting a stark contrast to the drama that once defined us. She apologized again, this time without excuses.
She admitted she'd felt jealous of my life for years, that being with Daniel had felt like proof that she could win too. Hearing her words hurt, but it also clarified something. Lydia's betrayal hadn't been about love, it had been about validation. I thanked her for the apology, told her I hoped she found what she was looking for, and walked away. Forgiveness, for me, didn't mean reconciliation, it meant releasing the grip of resentment. That night, as Marcus and I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, I told him about the encounter. He listened, then said, "It sounds like you closed a chapter." I realized he was right, not with anger or revenge, but with honesty. Months passed, the seasons changed. What Marcus and I built was slow and deliberate, rooted in mutual respect and shared values. There were still days when old wounds ached, when memories of Lydia's laughter or Daniel's promises resurfaced unexpectedly, but those moments no longer defined me. They were just part of the landscape I'd traveled through. Looking back now, I see the Gala not as the climax of my pain, but as the turning point of my growth. Betrayal stripped me down to my core, forced me to confront what I truly deserved. And in the quiet aftermath, I found something better than revenge. I found myself. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. The people who try to break you rarely expect you to rebuild stronger, quieter, and happier without them. And when you do, their power over you fades, replaced with a peace that no one can steal.
Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't sweep in like a dramatic orchestra swell, erasing the echoes of betrayal. It comes in small, ordinary moments that almost seem too simple to matter. A morning where you wake up and the first thought in your mind isn't about what you lost. An afternoon where you laugh without checking who's watching. An evening where silence feels comforting instead of lonely. That was how my healing unfolded after the Gala, not as a grand victory, but as a quiet rebuilding. Marcus became a steady presence in that rebuilding. He never tried to replace what I had lost. Instead, he created space for something new. We spent weekends visiting community projects outside the city, driving with the windows down, talking about ideas and dreams that felt grounded rather than grandiose. He asked questions that made me think about who I wanted to be in 5 years, not who I had been 5 years ago. That shift in perspective was subtle but powerful. For so long, my identity had been intertwined with Lydia and Daniel. Now I was defining it on my own terms. Still, the past has a way of testing you just when you think you've moved forward. 3 months after the grocery store encounter, I received an invitation that made my stomach twist. Lydia and Daniel were hosting a fundraising dinner for a different nonprofit, one that often collaborated with ours. The board suggested I attend to maintain professional goodwill. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once again, I would be in a room with them, but this time the roles were different. I wasn't the woman left behind. I wasn't the one being mocked. I was a respected leader in my field, invited because of my work, not my connections. When I told Marcus about it, he didn't immediately offer to come. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to go?" It was such a simple question, but it forced me to check in with myself. Did I feel obligated, afraid, or ready? After a long pause, I realized I wasn't dreading it. I was curious to see how it would feel to stand in the same room without the weight of heartbreak pressing down on me. "Yes," I said finally, "I want to go." The night of the dinner, I chose my outfit carefully, not to impress Lydia, but to feel confident in my own skin. Marcus accompanied me this time, not as a silent support in the shadows, but as my partner. When we walked into the venue, I felt a flicker of nerves, but they didn't consume me. The room buzzed with conversation, glasses clinking, familiar faces nodding and greeting. And then I saw them. Lydia spotted me first. Her expression shifted through a series of emotions so quickly it was almost dizzying. Surprise, irritation, something like apprehension. Daniel followed her gaze and stiffened. They approached us together, their movements rehearsed and controlled.
"I'm glad you could make it," Lydia said, her voice smooth but lacking its old edge. "Thank you for inviting us," I replied evenly. Marcus's hand rested lightly at the small of my back, grounding without claiming. Daniel offered a polite nod, avoiding direct eye contact. The contrast between this moment and the gala months earlier was stark. There was no mocking laughter, no triumphant smiles, just a careful civility that bordered on fragile. As the evening unfolded, I noticed subtle cracks in their dynamic. Lydia's laughter sounded forced, her glances toward Daniel sharp and questioning. Daniel seemed distracted, checking his phone more than once. At one point, during a speech about partnership and integrity, I caught Lydia staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't superiority, it looked almost like regret. During dessert, Lydia approached me alone. "Can we step outside for a minute?" she asked. Her tone was softer than I'd ever heard it. I hesitated, then nodded. We walked onto the terrace, the night air cool against my skin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I thought taking Daniel would make me feel bigger," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'd proven something. But it didn't. It just made everything smaller." I studied her face, searching for manipulation, but all I saw was exhaustion. "What are you trying to prove now?" I asked gently. She let out a shaky breath. "That I'm not the villain in my own story." Her words lingered between us. I realized then that Lydia's greatest punishment wasn't public embarrassment or social whispers. It was living with the knowledge of what she'd done. I didn't need to add to that burden. "You're not a villain, but you made choices, and choices have consequences." Tears welled in her eyes, surprising us both. "Do you ever miss me?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice cutting through years of tension. I did, in ways she couldn't understand. I missed the version of her who danced barefoot in my living room, who held my hand during scary doctor appointments, who knew my favorite songs by heart. But that version felt distant, almost imaginary. "I miss who we used to be," I admitted, "but I don't miss the person you became." She nodded, absorbing that truth. We stood there in silence, not as enemies, but as two women who had once loved each other deeply and failed to protect that love. When we returned inside, something had shifted. Not a reconciliation, not a renewed friendship, but a mutual understanding. Later that night, as Marcus and I drove home, he squeezed my hand. "You handled that with grace," he said. "It wasn't grace," I replied thoughtfully. "It was acceptance. Because that's what this journey had taught me. Acceptance doesn't mean approving of what happened. It means acknowledging it without letting it poison your present. Lydia's betrayal had carved a wound in my life, but it had also revealed my resilience. It had forced me to examine what loyalty truly meant, to recognize that self-respect must come before attachment. Months later, when Marcus proposed to me in the quiet of our favorite park, there were no grand gestures, no elaborate surprises, just a simple question, asked with steady eyes and genuine love. I said yes, not out of fear of being alone, not out of competition, but out of certainty. The certainty that I deserved a partnership built on trust, not rivalry. And when our wedding day arrived, Lydia wasn't there. Not because she wasn't invited, but because some chapters are meant to close quietly. As I walked down the aisle, I felt light, not because my past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined me. The gala where she once mocked me became just a memory, a turning point that led me here, to a love rooted in respect, to a life guided by purpose, to a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. Betrayal tried to rewrite my story, but in the end, I picked up the pen.
Marriage, the second time around for both of us, didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like coming home after a long journey, setting down your bags and realizing you didn't have to leave again. Marcus and I built our life slowly, intentionally. We kept our apartment at first, choosing practicality over grandeur, focusing on shared routines instead of appearances. Sunday mornings became sacred. Coffee on the balcony, newspapers spread across the table, quiet discussions about the week ahead. It was in those small, ordinary rituals that I felt the true contrast between what I had before and what I had now. Love no longer felt like a performance. It felt like partnership. But healing is rarely linear. Just when I thought the chapters with Lydia and Daniel had fully settled into the past, life presented another unexpected twist. It came in the form of a phone call on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing grant proposals when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was Daniel. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered, stripped of the confidence that once defined him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me he and Lydia had broken up. The words hung in the air, heavy but unsurprising. He said they tried to make it work, tried to prove to themselves and to others that their love had been worth the destruction it caused, but somewhere along the way the excitement of secrecy had faded, leaving behind unresolved insecurities and constant suspicion. "We built something on broken ground," he admitted quietly. "It was never stable." I listened without interrupting, not because I owed him my attention, but because I felt strangely detached from the story he was telling. It no longer belonged to me. When he finished, there was a long pause. He said, "I made a mistake, the biggest one of my life." In the past, those words would have pierced me, would have reignited old wounds. Now they felt distant. "I hope you learn from it," I replied gently. There was no bitterness in my voice, just truth. He hesitated, then asked if we could meet. I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, Marcus and I at the park where he proposed, our smiles unguarded and real. "There's nothing left to discuss," I said. "I've moved on. I truly wish you well, Daniel, but our chapter is closed." After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, letting the finality settle. Not with sadness, with clarity. The man I once thought I couldn't live without now felt like a distant memory, a lesson rather than a longing. That evening, I told Marcus about the call. He listened calmly, his expression thoughtful. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," I answered, surprising myself with how quickly the word came. And it was true. There was no lingering curiosity about what might have been, no secret satisfaction in hearing about their breakup, just a quiet acknowledgement that the path I was on had led me exactly where I needed to be. A few weeks later, I encountered Lydia one last time. It was at a community volunteer event. Ironic, considering that's where so much of this story began. She looked different again, not defeated, but introspective. When our eyes met, there was no hostility, no tension, just recognition. We ended up sorting donated books at the same table. The work gave us something neutral to focus on, something practical and grounding. After a while, she spoke. "Daniel told me he called you," she said softly. "I know," I replied. She nodded, her hands steady as she stacked novels into neat piles. "I don't blame you for anything," she added softly. "I used to. It was easier than blaming myself." Her honesty felt raw, unpolished. We all choose our own paths. Sometimes we just don't like where they lead. She gave a faint smile. "You look happy." "I am." And I meant it, not in a boastful way, not as a comparison, simply as a statement of fact. Happiness, I'd learned, isn't about winning against someone else. It's about aligning with your own values, your own truth. When the event ended, Lydia approached me before leaving. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I hope one day we can look back at our friendship without only remembering the ending." I considered her words carefully. "I already do," I admitted. "The good memories still matter, they just don't define me anymore." She seemed to exhale at that, as if releasing a burden she'd carried for too long. We didn't hug, we didn't promise to stay in touch. Some relationships aren't meant to be restored, they're meant to teach.
That night, lying beside Marcus, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Betrayal once felt like the end of everything, like a public humiliation I would never outgrow. But in reality, it had been a catalyst. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, about self-worth, about the difference between love and possession. I used to believe that losing Daniel to Lydia meant I wasn't enough. Now I understand that their choices were never about my inadequacy. They were about their own unresolved insecurities. And the moment I stopped internalizing their betrayal as a reflection of my value, I reclaimed my power. Marcus shifted beside me, pulling me closer in his sleep, his arm instinctively protective. I smiled in the darkness, grateful not just for him, but for the version of myself who had endured heartbreak without losing compassion, who had faced public mockery without retaliating in kind, who had chosen dignity over drama. If there's one thing I hope you carry from my story, it's this. When someone betrays you and laughs at your pain, they think they've taken something from you, but what they often give you, without realizing it, is clarity. Clarity about who they are, clarity about what you deserve, and clarity about the strength you didn't know you had. The gala where Lydia once mocked me no longer feels like a scar. It feels like a turning page. Because the moment she froze, realizing I wasn't alone, wasn't broken, wasn't defeated, that was the moment I understood something profound. Revenge isn't about making someone else suffer. It's about living so well that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. And in that irrelevance, you find peace.
Time has a quiet way of revealing the truth about everyone. Not the polished truth they present at galas or on social media, not the carefully rehearsed versions of themselves they use to win admiration. I'm talking about the truth that shows up in ordinary days, how someone handles disappointment, how they treat people when there's nothing to gain, how they sit with their own choices when the applause fades. About a year after Marcus and I married, our nonprofit was invited to collaborate on a citywide initiative. It was a major opportunity, more funding, more visibility, more responsibility. I was appointed as one of the lead coordinators, which meant attending monthly strategy meetings with leaders from several organizations. On the list of attendees, one name made me pause: Lydia. She had taken on a director role at a smaller foundation, and apparently she was doing well. For a moment, I felt the old tightening in my chest, that reflexive bracing for emotional impact, but it passed quickly. I wasn't the woman from the gala anymore. I wasn't fragile glass waiting to shatter. I was tempered steel, strong not because I had avoided heat, but because I had endured it. The first meeting took place in a large conference room downtown. When Lydia walked in, our eyes met briefly. There was no dramatic pause, no tension-filled silence, just acknowledgement. She nodded. I nodded back. Then we both turned our attention to the agenda in front of us. What struck me that day wasn't discomfort. It was professionalism. We spoke when necessary, collaborated when required, and kept everything focused on the work. There was no underlying hostility, no passive-aggressive remarks. It felt almost surreal. At one point, during a break, she approached me with a file in hand. "I read your proposal draft," she said. "It's solid. The outreach model is smart." "Thank you," I replied. "Your funding breakdown was thorough." And that was it. Two professionals exchanging respect. The simplicity of it surprised me. For so long, I had associated Lydia with chaos in my life, but here, in this structured environment, we were just two women doing a job. That evening, I told Marcus about the meeting while we prepared dinner together. He listened, chopping vegetables with steady hands. "Do you trust it?" he asked gently. "I don't know if trust is the right word," I said thoughtfully, "but I'm not afraid anymore." And that was the real difference. Fear had once shaped every interaction. Fear of being humiliated again, fear of not measuring up, fear of losing something precious. Now those fears felt distant, like echoes from another lifetime. Over the following months, the collaboration required more direct communication between Lydia and me.
Emails, conference calls, shared presentations. We found a rhythm, not friendship, not closeness, but functional respect. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old Lydia, the one who used to sit cross-legged on my living room floor dreaming about changing the world. In those moments, I felt a soft sadness, but not regret. One afternoon, after a particularly long planning session, we ended up alone in the conference room. The city skyline glowed outside the windows, dusk settling in. "You've changed," she said quietly. "So have I replied. She hesitated, then added, "I used to think strength meant taking what you wanted no matter the cost. I thought that made me bold, but I was just insecure." I appreciated the honesty, but I didn't rush to comfort her. "Growth is uncomfortable," I said. "It usually starts with mistakes." She gave a small, almost self-aware smile. "I made a big one." "Yes," I said softly, "you did." There was no cruelty in my tone, just acknowledgement. And strangely, that felt more powerful than anger ever had. Around that time, Marcus and I began discussing expanding our family. It was a vulnerable conversation, layered with hopes and uncertainties. When I found out I was pregnant, the joy felt almost fragile at first, like something too beautiful to touch. After everything I had lost and rebuilt, this new beginning felt sacred. We kept the news private for a while, sharing it only with close family and a few trusted colleagues. Eventually, as my pregnancy became more visible, the information naturally spread within our professional circles. The day Lydia found out, she approached me after a meeting. Her eyes went to my growing belly, and something softened in her expression. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. "You're going to be an incredible mother." "Thank you," I replied, feeling the warmth of her words without suspicion. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the woman who once mocked me at a gala, who believed taking my fiancé made her victorious, and I compared her to the woman who now stood in a conference room offering genuine congratulations. People can change, but only if they're willing to face themselves honestly. When our daughter was born, everything shifted again. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt a depth of love that reframed every past hurt. The betrayal, the humiliation, the tears, they became chapters that shaped me into the mother I wanted to be. Strong, compassionate, unafraid to walk away from what diminishes me. A few months after her birth, we hosted a small gathering to celebrate the initiative's successful completion. It was modest compared to that glittering gala years ago, but it felt more meaningful, real. Lydia attended with her team. When she saw my daughter, she smiled gently and said, "She's beautiful." I looked at Marcus, who was cradling our child with quiet awe, and then back at Lydia. "She is," I agreed. There was no rivalry in that moment, no scoreboard, just life unfolding. Later that night, as guests filtered out and the house grew quiet, Marcus wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You know," he murmured, "if that gala hadn't happened, none of this would." He was right. If Lydia hadn't betrayed me, I might have married Daniel. I might have built a life rooted in instability and hidden insecurities. The pain I thought would destroy me had actually redirected me. That's the thing about betrayal. It feels like an ending, but sometimes it's a redirection towards something truer. I no longer tell my story with bitterness. I tell it with gratitude for the clarity, for the resilience, for the love that followed loss. Lydia once froze when she saw who stood beside me, but what truly stunned her wasn't Marcus. It was the realization that I hadn't crumbled, that I had rebuilt without revenge, without spectacle, without losing my dignity. And in doing so, I had won something far greater than a man's loyalty. I had won myself.
Motherhood has a way of softening the sharpest edges of your past, not because it erases what happened, but because it reframes it. When I look down at my daughter, her tiny fingers curled around mine, her breath warm and steady against my chest, I understood something in a way I never had before. Love isn't proven by possession. It's proven by protection, by consistency, by choosing someone's well-being even when it costs you your pride. In the quiet months after her birth, my world grew smaller and fuller at the same time. Sleepless nights, soft lullabies, Marcus pacing the hallway with her tucked against his shoulder, whispering stories about kindness and courage as if she could already understand. Those moments felt sacred, and in that sacredness, the old pain from Lydia and Daniel seemed almost distant, like a storm I had survived years ago. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without flinching. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the infamous Gala, I received a message that surprised me. It wasn't from Daniel this time. It was from Lydia. The message was simple. Could we meet? I need advice, not about us, about something important. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part, the part that had grown steadier over the years, felt curious. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I wasn't threatened. So I agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near my office. When she arrived, I noticed how differently she carried herself compared to the woman who once smirked at my heartbreak. There was no sharpness in her posture, no competitive glint in her eyes, just fatigue and something like humility. After we ordered coffee, she got straight to the point. "I'm stepping down from my position," she said. I blinked. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I've been chasing titles instead of purpose, and I'm tired." Her honesty caught me off guard. Lydia had always thrived on appearances, on being seen as impressive, accomplished, enviable. "What will you do instead?" I asked gently. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. You've always known who you are in this work, even when everything else fell apart." For a moment, I saw her not as the woman who could trade me, but as someone lost in her own insecurities, and I realized something quietly profound. Her theft of Daniel hadn't been about love, it had been about identity. She had wanted what she thought my life represented: stability, admiration, certainty. But those things can't be stolen, they have to be built. You don't need to chase what other people admire. You need to figure out what actually fulfills you. She looked down at her cup. "And what if I don't like what I find?" "Then you change," I replied simply. "That's what growth is." There was a long silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt reflective, mature. When we parted ways, she thanked me, not in the overly dramatic way she used to, but quietly, sincerely. Driving home that day, I thought about the strange evolution of our relationship. We would never be what we once were. That innocence was gone. But perhaps something more realistic had replaced it, a cautious respect built on hard lessons. A few months later, our organization hosted another gala, not as extravagant as the one that marked the collapse of my first engagement, but significant nonetheless. This time, I wasn't just a coordinator, I was the executive director. Standing backstage before my speech, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I saw lines around my eyes that hadn't been there years ago. I saw confidence rooted in experience rather than optimism. I saw a woman who had walked through betrayal and chosen not to become bitter. Marcus stood beside me, adjusting his cufflinks. "You ready?" he asked softly. I smiled, more than ever. Out in the ballroom, the energy felt different. There was no underlying tension, no unspoken drama, just community, purpose, collaboration. Lydia attended as well, but not in a leadership capacity. She had taken on a mentorship role at a grassroots organization, less glamorous, more hands-on. I'd heard from colleagues that she was thriving there. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause felt warm, not performative. I began my speech with gratitude, then shifted into something more personal. "Years ago," I said, my voice steady, "I stood at a similar podium during one of the most difficult seasons of my life. I had just learned that sometimes the people closest to us can disappoint us deeply, and I wasn't sure how I would move forward." The room grew quieter. "But what I discovered," I continued, "is that betrayal doesn't define your future unless you let it. Pain can either harden you or refine you. It can make you smaller, or it can stretch you into someone stronger." I didn't mention Lydia, I didn't mention Daniel, but I didn't need to.
The truth was woven in every word. After the speech, as guests mingled and congratulated the team, Lydia approached me. Her eyes were bright, not in envy, but in something softer. "That was beautiful," she said. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for." I met her gaze calmly. "I didn't need your credit." For a split second, her old defensiveness flickered, but it faded quickly. She nodded, accepting the boundary embedded in my words. Later that night, after the last table was cleared and the final lights dimmed, Marcus and I stood alone in the ballroom. I looked around at the empty chairs, the stage, the polished floors reflecting soft light, and I felt a wave of emotion, not sadness, not triumph, but closure. The first gala had marked my humiliation, the second had marked my resilience, and this one marked my peace. On the drive home, Marcus reached for my hand. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if she hadn't betrayed you?" he asked. "I used to," I admitted, "but not anymore. Because the truth is, without that betrayal, I might never have examined my own boundaries. I might never have demanded better. I might never have met a man who valued me not as a prize to win, but as a partner to respect." When we pulled into our driveway, the porch light glowing softly, I felt overwhelming gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for what it revealed. Lydia once mocked me publicly, thinking she had taken something irreplaceable, but what she didn't understand was that the only irreplaceable thing in my life was my self-worth, and that she could never steal. As I tucked my daughter into bed later that night, brushing a curl from her forehead, I whispered a quiet promise to her and to myself. Never measure your value by someone else's choices. Never compete for love that should be freely given. And never let betrayal convince you that you are less than whole. Because sometimes the greatest comeback isn't loud. It's living well. There's a strange thing that happens when you truly move on from something that once broke you. You stop rehearsing the old scenes in your mind. You stop imagining clever comebacks you wish you had said. You stop wondering whether the other person regrets what they did. The past loses its grip, not because it disappears, but because it no longer holds power over your present. By the time my daughter turned 3, Lydia and I had settled into a distant but respectful coexistence. We worked in overlapping circles, occasionally exchanged emails, and saw each other at professional events. The tension that once defined our interactions had faded into something neutral. Not warm, not cold, just neutral. Daniel, on the other hand, drifted further from our world. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had relocated to another city, taken a corporate job unrelated to nonprofit work. The man who once claimed community service was his life's passion had quietly stepped away from it. I didn't judge him for that. People change. But I couldn't help noticing the contrast between the ideals he once professed and the choices he ultimately made. One evening, as I was sorting through old files in my home office, I stumbled across a photograph from years ago. It was from the gala, the first one, the one where Lydia had stood beside Daniel with that triumphant smile. I stared at the image for a long time. I expected to feel a sting, some echo of humiliation. Instead, I felt compassion for the woman in the photo, me. She looked poised, composed, but I remembered how fragile she felt inside. I wished I could reach through the image and whisper to her, "You're going to be okay, better than okay." Marcus walked in just as I slipped the photo back into the drawer. "What's that?" he asked gently. "Just an old memory," I replied. He studied my face for a moment. "Does it still hurt?" I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said honestly. "It reminds me." "Of what?" "Of who I used to think I had to be." Back then, I believed being strong meant never letting anyone see your pain. It meant maintaining composure at all costs, even when your heart was splintering. But over the years, I learned that real strength isn't about suppressing emotion, it's about honoring it without letting it define you. A few months later, something unexpected happened that tested that lesson once more. Our organization was nominated for a prestigious Community Leadership Award. It was a huge honor, one that would bring significant visibility and funding. As executive director, I was asked to represent us at the awards ceremony. When I reviewed the list of other nominees, my breath caught. Lydia's grassroots organization was nominated in the same category. For a moment, the old narrative threatened to resurface: competition, comparison, who had won in life. But I caught myself. This wasn't about rivalry, it was about impact. The ceremony took place in a grand theater downtown. As Marcus and I took our seats, I noticed Lydia across the aisle with her team. She looked nervous, adjusting the sleeves of her blazer repeatedly. When our eyes met, she offered a tentative smile. I returned it. As the presenter began announcing the finalists, my heart pounded, not out of fear of losing to Lydia, but out of hope for the work itself. When they finally announced the winner, it was her organization. The applause erupted around us. For a split second, I felt a flicker of disappointment, not envy, just the natural sting of coming close. Then I saw Lydia's face as she rose from her seat: shock, gratitude, humility. It wasn't the smug expression from years ago. It was vulnerable and genuine. Without overthinking it, I stood and clapped enthusiastically. Marcus squeezed my hand approvingly. As Lydia took the stage, she began her speech with gratitude for her team. Then, unexpectedly, she said something that made the entire room shift. "Years ago," she said, her voice slightly trembling, "I made personal choices that cost me relationships and perspective. I thought success meant standing above others, but I've learned that real leadership is about lifting people up, even when you've fallen short yourself." She paused, scanning the audience. Her gaze found mine. And I wouldn't be standing here tonight without the example of someone who showed me what grace under pressure truly looks like. A hush fell over the theater. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Emotion rose unexpectedly in my throat. Not pride, not vindication, something softer: closure. After the ceremony, Lydia approached me backstage. There were cameras flashing, reporters asking questions, but for a moment it felt like just the two of us. "You didn't have to clap like that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did. The work matters," I replied. She nodded, her eyes glossy. "Thank you." And for the first time in years, the word didn't feel complicated between us. On the drive home, Marcus glanced at me thoughtfully. "How are you feeling?" I leaned back in my seat, watching the city lights blur past the window. "Proud," I said. Not because we lost gracefully, but because I didn't feel the need to win. That was the final shift. The woman who once stood in a ballroom fighting back tears while her best friend mocked her had evolved into someone who could celebrate that same woman's success without bitterness. Not because I had forgotten the betrayal, but because I had grown beyond it. When we arrived home, my daughter ran into my arms asking if we had won. I knelt down and kissed her forehead. "Not tonight," I said gently. "Are you sad?" she asked with innocent concern. I smiled. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes other people get their turn, and that's okay." As I tucked her into bed, I reflected on how far I'd come. Betrayal once felt like a public spectacle that would define my identity forever, but identity isn't built in moments of humiliation. It's built in the choices you make afterward. I chose dignity when I could have chosen revenge. I chose growth when I could have chosen resentment. I chose love when I could have chosen fear. And in doing so, I reclaimed something Lydia could never take from me. Not a fiancé, not a title, not applause, but my peace. If you had told me on the night of that first gala that one day Lydia and I would sit side by side in mutual respect, I would have thought you were cruel for even suggesting it. Some wounds feel too deep to ever soften. Some betrayals feel too personal to ever neutralize. But time, when paired with honest reflection, does something extraordinary. It doesn't erase what happened, it rearranges its meaning.
Years passed, not in dramatic leaps, but in ordinary milestones. My daughter started kindergarten. Marcus expanded his consulting practice into something larger than he'd ever imagined, mentoring young professionals who reminded him of himself at their age, idealistic, underappreciated, hungry to do meaningful work. I found deeper purpose in leadership, advocating for mental health support within nonprofit spaces, ensuring that burnout and emotional strain weren't brushed aside the way they once had been in my own life. And Lydia, she kept growing too. Her grassroots organization flourished under her quieter leadership style. She stopped chasing recognition and started focusing on tangible impact. People spoke of her differently now, not as ambitious in a sharp, competitive way, but as dedicated and grounded. I noticed it the first time I overheard someone praise her integrity. The word struck me, integrity. It had once felt like the very thing she lacked. But perhaps integrity, like strength, can be cultivated after failure. One spring afternoon, I received an invitation that felt surreal in its simplicity. Lydia was hosting a small mentorship luncheon for young women entering nonprofit leadership. She asked if I would co-speak. I stared at the email longer than I probably needed to. There was a time when the idea of standing beside her publicly would have felt impossible. Now it felt like an opportunity, not to rewrite history, but to demonstrate growth. I agreed. The luncheon was intimate, held in a sunlit community center room with folding chairs and homemade pastries laid out on simple tables, nothing like the glittering galas of years past, and yet it felt more meaningful. When Lydia introduced me to the group, there was no awkwardness in her tone, just respect. She taught me, Lydia said, that resilience isn't about pretending you're unbreakable, it's about rebuilding with honesty. I met her eyes briefly, acknowledging the weight of that statement. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't share every detail of our history, but I did speak about betrayal in general terms, about how leadership requires self-awareness, about how envy, when left unchecked, can poison relationships, and about how forgiveness isn't about restoring what was, it's about freeing yourself from carrying it forever. Afterward, several young women approached us with questions about boundaries, about navigating friendships in competitive environments, about staying grounded when success becomes tempting. One of them asked a question that lingered with me long after the event ended. "How do you trust again," she asked softly, "after someone you loved betrays you?" The room grew quiet. I took a breath before answering. You don't start by trusting someone else, you start by trusting yourself, trusting that you'll recognize red flags, trusting that you'll walk away sooner if you need to, trusting that you deserve respect. I felt Marcus's presence in the back of the room, steady as always. I thought about how my second chance at love had only been possible because I had rebuilt my self-trust first. After the luncheon, Lydia and I lingered as volunteers cleaned up. There was a comfortable silence between us. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked eventually. "The gala?" I clarified. She nodded. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with anger." She exhaled slowly. "I replayed it for years, the look on your face when I laughed. I thought I'd won something." "And what do you think now?" I asked gently. "I think I was terrified," she said, "terrified that I would never measure up. Taking Daniel felt like proof that I could." I considered her words carefully. "You were always enough, you just didn't believe it." She swallowed hard, emotion flickering across her face. "Neither did you," she replied quietly. And she was right. Back then, I believed being chosen by someone else validated my worth. I believed loyalty from a partner equaled security. But real security doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself, even when it's painful. A few weeks later, Marcus and I celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary. We kept it simple. Dinner at home after putting our daughter to bed, candles flickering softly on the table. At one point, Marcus raised his glass and said something that caught me off guard.
"To the gala," he said with a faint smile. I laughed. "That's an odd toast." "Not really," he replied. "It's where your life changed." He was right. That humiliating, devastating night had set everything else into motion. It felt strange to acknowledge it with gratitude, but I did. "To resilience," I amended softly. "To resilience," he agreed. Later that night, as I lay awake listening to the quiet rhythm of our home, I reflected on how different my story might have been. If Lydia hadn't betrayed me, if Daniel had remained faithful, if the gala had been uneventful, maybe I would have married Daniel and slowly shrunk myself to maintain harmony. Maybe Lydia's insecurities would have surfaced in other ways. Maybe I would have stayed blind to the subtle ways I undervalued myself. Pain, as unwelcome as it was, forced clarity. It forced me to ask hard questions about what I tolerated. It forced me to define love not by grand gestures, but by daily respect. It forced me to understand that someone else's betrayal is not a verdict on your worth, it's a revelation of theirs. Years ago, Lydia froze when she saw Marcus standing beside me, but what truly froze her wasn't him, it was the realization that she hadn't destroyed me. And over time, I realized something even deeper. She hadn't defeated me. She hadn't outgrown me. She hadn't taken something irreplaceable. She had simply redirected me toward a love built on steadiness, toward leadership built on integrity, toward a version of myself that no longer feared being alone. When I look back now, I don't see a villain and a victim. I see two women who didn't understand their own insecurities yet. One acted from envy, the other learned from pain. And in the end, growth, not revenge, was the real triumph.
I thought the worst of it was over once the police led Vanessa out of that ballroom, her heels scraping against marble, her mascara streaking like war paint melting in defeat. I thought exposure would be the end. I was wrong. Exposure was only the beginning, because when someone has built their entire life on mirrors, they don't know how to live without reflections, and when the mirrors shatter, they bleed on everyone around them. The days after the gala felt unreal. News outlets picked up the story quickly. Socialite charged with charity fraud. Prominent event planner accused of embezzlement. My phone buzzed with messages from people who had once ignored me. Some apologized. Some pretended they had always suspected something. Some asked if I was okay, as if betrayal was a fever that could be measured with a thermometer. I didn't respond to most of them. Daniel called once. I let it go to voicemail. His voice trembled through the speaker. He said he never meant for things to go this far. He said he thought Vanessa was just misunderstood. He said he was sorry. Sorry. It's a small word, 4 letters, but it has to carry so much weight, and sometimes it collapses under it. I met him one last time. Not because I wanted closure from him, but because I needed closure for myself. We sat in a quiet cafe on a rainy afternoon. The windows were fogged, the world outside blurred and softened by water. Daniel looked smaller somehow, not physically, just diminished. He tried to explain. He said Vanessa made him feel powerful. She admired him loudly. She pushed him toward bigger clients, flashier venues. She told him he deserved more than a quiet life. He admitted that he liked being seen as the ambitious one, the bold one. "And what was I asked softly. He couldn't answer. Silence filled the space between us, thick and undeniable. I realized then that he had not fallen in love with Vanessa. He had fallen in love with the version of himself he thought she reflected back to him, and when that reflection cracked, he had nowhere to stand. "I loved you," he said finally. "I know," I replied, "but love without loyalty is just noise." I left him there with his untouched coffee and walked out into the rain. I didn't cry. The tears had already come and gone. What I felt instead was something steadier, a quiet resolve, a sense that the chapter had closed, not with a bang, but with a firm, deliberate click.
The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. Evidence was overwhelming: bank transfers, forged documents, misdirected funds. My mother's team worked efficiently, but without cruelty. She never gloated. She never made public statements attacking Vanessa. She simply ensured that justice moved forward with dignity. That was a lesson in itself. I visited Vanessa once before her court date, not because I owed her anything, but because I needed to see her without the spotlight. She was in a small holding room, her hair pulled back, no makeup, no designer gown to armor her. For the first time in our lives, she looked human. She didn't sneer, she didn't mock, she just looked tired. "Why did you come?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe to understand?" She laughed, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was hollow. "You always wanted to understand people. I just wanted to win." There it was, the truth stripped bare. She admitted she had envied me for years, my steadiness, my ability to build relationships without calculation. She said she hated how people trusted me naturally. She thought if she took Daniel, if she took the gala, if she took the spotlight, she would finally feel like she had something that was truly hers. But it still wasn't enough, she whispered. It never is, I thought. I didn't forgive her in that room. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip to appear gracious. It's a process. But I did let go of the anger I had been clutching like a shield because I realized something important. Holding on to that anger kept me tethered to her, and I wanted to be free. When the verdict came, she was sentenced to several years, with restitution ordered to repay the stolen funds. The gala's donations were recovered through seized assets. The shelter project resumed, this time under full transparency and oversight. The community rallied in a way I hadn't expected. Donations actually increased. People said they wanted to stand against corruption by supporting something honest. I poured myself into the work. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't building something to prove a point. I wasn't trying to match anyone's shine. I was simply doing what I had always believed in, quietly, steadily, with intention. My relationship with my mother deepened too. We had always loved each other, but after that night, there was a new layer of understanding between us. I saw the strength it took for her to remain silent all those years about her influence, letting me find my own footing. She saw the strength it took for me to stand alone in that ballroom before she stepped forward. We began working together more closely, not as a safety net and a dependent, but as partners. She respected my vision, I respected her experience. We didn't overshadow each other, we amplified. As for Daniel, he moved to another city. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he tried to rebuild his career, but the scandal followed him. Not legally, he wasn't charged, but socially. Trust, once fractured, leaves a mark. I don't wish him harm. I simply wish him growth. Months passed. The shelter opened its doors. I stood at the entrance on opening day, watching families walk in with cautious hope in their eyes. Children clutched backpacks. Mothers held on to hands a little too tightly. The building smelled of fresh paint and possibility. A reporter asked me what kept me going after such public humiliation. I smiled gently. It wasn't humiliation, it was revelation. Because that's what it had been, a revealing of character, of mine, of Vanessa's, of Daniel's, of my mother's, of the people who chose to stay when it would have been easier to drift away. Betrayal doesn't just show you who others are, it shows you who you are when everything comfortable is stripped away. That night at the gala, when Vanessa thought she had destroyed me, she unknowingly handed me the greatest gift: clarity. She forced me to stand in the truth of my own worth without leaning on anyone else's validation. I learned that loyalty is louder than applause, that integrity shines brighter than diamonds under chandeliers, that the quiet strength you build over years cannot be stolen in a single dramatic moment. And most of all, I learned that the people who mock you at your lowest often freeze not because you rise higher than them, but because they finally see that you were never beneath them at all. I no longer measure my life by who stands beside me at a gala. I measure it by who stands beside me when the lights go out. Vanessa chased reflections. Daniel chased admiration. I chose substance. And in the end, substance lasts. I sometimes think back to that exact second in the ballroom when my mother stepped forward and the air shifted, the gasp, the silence, the look on Vanessa's face. But I don't replay it with bitterness anymore. I replay it as a reminder. Truth doesn't shout. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need theatrics.
There's something no one tells you about surviving betrayal. After the headlines fade, after the courtrooms empty, after the whispers die down, you're left alone with yourself. And that can be the most confronting part of all, because when the noise disappears, you can finally hear your own thoughts clearly. The shelter had been open for 3 months when I found myself standing alone in the main hallway one evening, long after the staff had gone home. The walls were lined with children's drawings, crayon houses with crooked roofs, stick figure families holding hands, suns that took up half the sky. The kind of drawings that don't care about perspective or perfection, just feeling. I walked slowly past them, letting my fingers brush against the paper edges. Each picture represented a family that at once felt displaced, uncertain, unsafe, and now they had somewhere to land. For a moment, I thought about the version of me from a year ago, the woman who believed her world was stable because she had a fiancé, a best friend, and a perfectly planned gala ahead of her. I almost wanted to reach back and gently warn her. But if I had, she might not have become who I am now. Growth rarely comes wrapped in comfort. It usually arrives disguised as heartbreak. The biggest surprise wasn't that I had survived losing Daniel. It wasn't even that I had survived Vanessa's public humiliation. It was that I had survived the shattering of an identity I didn't even realize I was clinging to. I had always been the loyal one, the dependable one, the quiet supporter. I built my self-worth around being the person who held everything together. But that night at the gala forced me to stand alone, not as someone's fiancé, not as someone's friend, not as someone hidden behind a powerful mother's shadow, just me. And that was terrifying at first. I remember the first time I attended a public event after everything happened. It was a smaller fundraiser hosted at a local art gallery. The chandeliers were modest, the guest list was shorter, the press was minimal. As I stepped inside, I felt eyes turn toward me. Not hostile, not pitying, just curious. I used to hate that kind of attention, but this time I didn't shrink. I walked with steady steps, greeted people warmly, and spoke about the shelter's progress with confidence. Not to prove anything, not to reclaim a spotlight, just because the work mattered. Halfway through the evening, an older woman approached me. She held my hand and said softly, "You handled that storm with grace. My granddaughter looks up to you now." I blinked in surprise. I had never considered that anyone would see strength in what I thought was simply survival. That's when I understood something powerful. Your response to betrayal becomes someone else's blueprint for resilience. I wasn't just living my own story anymore. I was showing others that you can be publicly wounded and still privately whole. As for Vanessa, I heard updates occasionally through legal reports, appeals denied, assets liquidated, silence where there had once been endless self-promotion. I didn't follow her story closely, not because I didn't care, but because my focus had shifted. I no longer needed her downfall to validate my worth. Forgiveness came slowly. It wasn't a single moment of absolution. It was a gradual loosening of resentment, a quiet decision each day not to let anger rent space in my heart. One afternoon, months later, I received a handwritten letter. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was familiar. Vanessa.
I sat at my desk for a long time before opening it. My hands didn't shake, my breathing didn't quicken. That alone told me how much I had healed. Her letter wasn't dramatic, it wasn't defensive, it was simple. She wrote that prison had stripped her of everything except reflection. She admitted she had confused competition with connection her entire life. She said watching me stand calmly in that ballroom had unsettled her more than my mother's reveal ever could. You didn't scream, you didn't beg, you just stood there like you already knew you'd be okay. I stared at that sentence for a while, because the truth was I hadn't known I would be okay. I had been terrified, but I had chosen not to let that terror dictate my posture. Strength isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision not to perform it for those who wish to see you crumble. I wrote back eventually, not to rekindle friendship, not to reopen doors, but to close them gently. I wished her accountability, growth, insight. I told her she would learn to build something that didn't require someone else's destruction. And then I let the past rest. A year after the gala, we hosted another charity event, smaller, intimate, focused entirely on the families we served. There were no flashy centerpieces, no celebrity guest lists, just community leaders, volunteers, and families who had found stability. My mother stood beside me, but this time no one gasped at her presence. They already knew, and I wasn't introduced as her daughter with surprise attached. I was introduced as the founder of a thriving initiative. The applause felt different. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about substance. As I stepped up to speak, I paused for a moment, looking at the faces before me, some smiling, some emotional, some simply grateful. I used to believe that losing people meant losing parts of myself, but I've learned that when the wrong people walk away, they make space for the right parts of you to grow. There were quiet nods in the audience. I was betrayed by someone I trusted deeply, and for a long time I thought that meant I had been foolish. But trust isn't foolish, it's courageous, and I would rather be someone who trusted and healed than someone who manipulated and hollowed out. My voice didn't shake, it carried. After the event, as the room emptied and volunteers stacked chairs, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The night air was cool. The city lights shimmered in the distance. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not because justice had been served, not because my name had been cleared, but because I had reclaimed ownership of my narrative. Vanessa once mocked me at a gala believing she had stolen my future. What she didn't realize is that my future was never something she could take. It was something I would build, brick by brick, choice by choice. Daniel once chose admiration over authenticity. I chose authenticity over applause. And my mother, she showed me that true power doesn't rush in to rescue. It waits until you've shown your own strength, then stands beside you as an equal. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this. Betrayal reveals character, but it does not define destiny. You are not the humiliation you endure. You are the response you choose. Sometimes I still remember the sound of that ballroom gasp, the freeze on Vanessa's face, the moment everything shifted. But now, when I think of that night, I don't feel pain. I feel gratitude. Because that was the night I stopped being afraid of standing alone. And when you are no longer afraid of standing alone, no one can ever truly steal anything from you again.